Well, welcome everyone to Goldfinch Bio's first Kidney Month patient panel discussion. I'm Leron Walsh. I lead the clinical development efforts here at Goldfinch. I want to welcome and thank our panel members who you'll have a chance to meet and hear their stories very shortly. This is a newly created panel, and the goal for us is to address the significant challenges to finding new treatments in kidney disease. And with the help of our panelists, we'd like to get their firsthand experiences to the challenges and the hopes of living with kidney disease and for new treatments. Our patient advisors are playing a key role to advance our mission to develop new therapies for patients and bring renewed hope and an improved quality of life for patients living with kidney diseases. We're grateful for their willingness to share their insights and perspectives on an ongoing basis. We'll explore their stories with kidney disease, the treatments that they've used, the quality of life and the impact it's had on their lives, as well as their hope for the future. With that, welcome everyone. We're thrilled to have you here, and we sincerely thank you for your participation.
Thank you.
So welcome everyone, and again, thank you for joining. I think the first question that we have for everybody here as we get to know each other really is to talk about your personal journeys, both as a patient or as a mother. I'm just going to go around the room here, the virtual room, and I'll start with you, Dean. Perhaps you can give us an introduction to yourself and tell us about your journey with kidney disease.
Hi, thank you. I'm Dean Watson. I live in Washington, D.C. I'm a writer. I was diagnosed with FSGS in 1984. I was 33 years old. I'm almost 70 now, so that lets you know how many years I've been dealing with this issue. I was diagnosed with FSGS because a doctor found protein in my urine during a regular physical examination. She sent me to see a nephrologist who did tests and a biopsy and diagnosed me with FSGS. In a second opinion at the Mayo Clinic, the diagnosis was reconfirmed, but I was told that my disease might never progress to full-blown kidney disease. And for 10 years, it did not. But in about the mid-90s, my creatinine levels started rising. And by 2000, I was on dialysis for about 3 months, and then I had a kidney transplant in March of 2000. I had full-blown kidney failure again when my FSGS returned, and that was just 4.5 years later. And I was on dialysis for 5 years and had another kidney transplant in 2009. And so my kidney and I have been together for 11 years now.
Wonderful. Well, let's go over to Kent, and then to Jill, and then Shannon, and then we'll come around just for some additional questions. Kent?
Hello, everyone. My name is Kent Bressler, and I'm a retired RN with roughly 40 years of nursing experience in the VA and in the private sector, and I'm also a veteran. I found out that I had protein in my urine early on in 1970, roughly 1970, when I was drafted. Somebody mentioned that Bressler had protein in his urine, and I thought probably that may allow me a chance to go home, but it didn't. So I progressed with the disease, not really actually knowing all about it until I had a hypertensive crisis in 1982. So roughly 12 years later, I actually built a career and was working with FSGS really in a blur I was biopsied in 1984 and found to have FSGS. It was confirmed twice, once at the university at San Antonio, and was secondarily checked at Johns Hopkins. And back then there was very little known about what FSGS was, but it was explained to me as hardening of the arteries of the kidney. And we know a little bit more about it now.
Mm-hmm.
In that period of time, I spent a lot of time, what I call within a fear factor, because when the doctor told me what I had, he mentioned to me, this disease process, we really would like to see you get a transplant, which I was very grateful for. Didn't mention anything about dialysis. He just said, I think you do really well on getting a transplant. And he actually assisted me in doing that. I had 2 days only of dialysis, which is a blessing, just to experience how difficult it is on your body. And I went straight to transplant in 1987. So I've had my kidney, actually I had my brother's kidney, thank you very much, for 33 years. In April it'll be 34.
Wow.
Truly blessed to have had this occurrence. But I remember going back to when I was biopsied and when it was explained to me, the most difficult thing for me to understand or get my arms around was the fact that this might return. And that was evidenced by Dean's response to transplants, and FSGS does return. Fortunately for me, the blessing is it hasn't. My creatinine level is normal even at this stage. So once again, I want to thank my brother.
Thanks, Kent. Jill, would you like to relay your story for us?
Sure. I was diagnosed with FSGS 29 years ago, and like Dean and Kent, the doctor found urine in my protein, and the only reason I went to the doctor was because I woke up one morning and my face was extremely swollen. And it wasn't for some years before it was many years before my kidneys failed, but I had a transplant in 1999. Was my first transplant, and that was a living donor for my mom. That FSGS returned 2 weeks after the transplant, and that transplant lasted about 8 years. And then I was on dialysis for about 8 months, and then a friend of mine donated a kidney. That kidney lasted 11 years, but the FSGS returned very quickly after that transplant as well. And so I will be going in July, I'll be going on 3 years for my third transplant, which was from my sister. So I have been blessed to have 3 living donors. But unfortunately, once again, FSGS returned in the third transplant. And so I'm currently at stage 3B of kidney disease. And I am undergoing lots of treatments to try and maintain the kidney function that I currently have.
Thanks, Jill. And Shannon?
Hi, everybody. My name is Shannon Mulroy, and I'm here in Long Island, New York. I'm a mom to Julia, who is now 18 years old. And we were first blindsided by FSGS when she was a freshman in high school. I use the word blindsided because that's exactly what happened. She was an active teen that played lacrosse and soccer and enjoyed life, to being blindsided with this disease that has no cure. So it was very aggressive, whereas she was a freshman in high school, and 2 years later, she was in end-stage kidney failure and started dialysis in her junior year of high school. So she spent the majority of her high school being pretty sick, just in and out of the hospital. The horrible side effects of steroids, which caused all the stretch marks on her legs, which, as a high school girl with body imaging and what have you, she gained a tremendous amount of weight and, the typical steroid side effects. So She was steroid resistant and no treatment had worked for her. So it aggressively, very fast went into end stage. Shortly after the dialysis, she was on for 6 months, and then she had a kidney transplant, and it recurred almost immediately. So I, at that point, said, geez, it went so fast. The last time, I feel like we're just, unfortunately, in my head, I'm thinking, is this going to happen again in 2 years from now? We're a year and 9 months in at this point. So it's always in the back of my head, but I try to keep optimistic about it. But she is now in college and trying to live her life.
That's great. Yeah, it's all your stories are very compelling and really important to share. You know, one thing, Shannon, that you mentioned is blindsided, and when you mentioned blindsided, the panel nodded in agreement. I can't really imagine what that must be like, and I'm wondering if you can provide us with, you know, what was it like emotionally for you and your daughter, and then I'd like to hear about the others too. I mean, that's something we've talked about last time, is the emotional part about this illness. I'd like to hear about, you know, what that felt like for you and your daughter, Shannon.
Well, the first thing for me was that the scariest part for me is knowing that I had no idea. I couldn't even pronounce the name. I'm like, nephrotic. What? I never even heard of it. Like most people, never even heard of this word, the term. And the first thing that came to mind was I thought about my father, who had passed away, and he was on dialysis and end stage kidney failure. And my niece, my sister's daughter, who was 24, and she was on end stage kidney failure on dialysis. It took me a real long time, many, many months, to process the fact that I will never know what caused my daughter's disease. That's something that was very hard for me to really wrap my head around, that I won't know. You know, my father, after I processed everything and learned, everything I could possibly learn about it, I realized that my father and my niece, theirs was a secondary condition. My father was a military, army, and this was a secondary condition, and along with my niece was a secondary. So it had nothing to do with my daughter's. But to not know what caused something, and then even worse, to know that there's no cure. And she has a twin brother. So to me, I'm watching her brother, I'm looking at his eyes. Is his eyes swollen? I hate to even admit, I was, wanting to see, his urine. I mean, it seems strange. I want to see if there's foam there. It's such a strange feeling, but it was, I was determined right from the very beginning. I was very, very determined to find everything I could out about this and try to move forward.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And Jill, what was it like when that diagnosis came, or maybe even the journey to the diagnosis?
Yeah, so I
like
was
knowing something was wrong, but not knowing what or why.
right. I was 14 when I was first diagnosed, and I had just moved to a new town. So I was new to school, and I'm waking up and I'm swollen. And of course, it took a while before I had a biopsy and before tests determined, that this was what they called nephrotic syndrome. And of course, none of us knew what that meant either. So like Shannon, we were kind of at a loss, very much blindsided. I think I was naive at the time to think, oh, I'm going to take these medications that the doctor prescribed, which were these large doses of prednisone. The disease is going to go away and this will all be behind me. And obviously 29 years later, that's far from the case. So it's been taxing emotionally. There's been some depression and anxiety surrounding test results, and is it getting worse, and how rapidly is it declining? And so I do struggle at times with depression and some anxiety.
Yeah, I can only imagine. And Dean?
Well, when I had always been very healthy. And when I was diagnosed with FSGS, I just didn't believe it would ever really affect my life very much. And when a specialist at the Mayo Clinic said, "Oh, your creatinine, you have FSGS, but your creatinine is very low, and there's very little protein in your urine, and we see some scarring, but it's not a lot. You may never progress to full-blown kidney failure. And that was the case for a decade. And I just thought I was going to live a healthy life. When I found out that after my first transplant failed, and then my second transplant failed, and I had to go on dialysis, I was just scared to death. I even saw someone die in dialysis. I was ashamed to be on dialysis because, I felt like I had failed somehow. My body had failed me. I had associated dialysis with people who didn't take care of themselves. And I always had. And I was resentful of the time that it took out of my life. And so I had to really work to convince myself that with this disease, that I could still have a productive life.
Yeah, wow. And Kent?
I think the most obvious thing to me was the fact that I was raising a family. I had two children. They were both, when I really knew what was going on after the diagnosis, they were teenage. One was a teenager and one was coming up to be a teenager. I think she was 11 going on 13, but I was a sick man. I mean, I went through a lot of, I was very fearful. I didn't know how it was going to turn out. And if I hadn't had a really great wife who said, you know what, why don't we just deal with this? Why don't we don't know. They know so little about it. Why don't let's just take it day to day. She was my rock. And the whole idea was more scary because I didn't understand, even as an RN, how this was going to progress. The thought that it would progress slowly was in my mind because I used denial early on to say, this can't be that bad. It sounds bad from Doc Mulgrew, but you know what? It can't be that bad. Well, it was, and it progressed. And once it really, you hit that curve when you're on the downside, it goes real fast.
It does.
So you don't have an opportunity. I know we're going to talk about therapeutics and stuff a little later, but you don't have the opportunity, and your body's constantly adjusting. You don't feel the anemia. You feel it. The only thing you really get to feeling is the shortness of breath when it starts involving your heart. So to me, I didn't want to go on dialysis and had long talks with my nephrologist. And consequently, I think there's a reason for that because now I work in the field of trying to think about preemptive transplant. Let's go before we get to dialysis. Let's talk transplant. Let's not talk dialysis. If that's an opportunity, it should be afforded to everyone.
Sure.
So consequently, my fear got generated. I passed a few times after the transplant where I was able to get good numbers. I got a year out, then I got 3 years out, then I got 5 years out, and then I got 10 years out. But you know what? It's always in the back of your head. That fear that it's going to come back. And I know Jill experienced it, and Dean, and it's horrible. Every time that laboratory test is available, I wanted to see it right away. And I was afforded that in the arena that I was at. So I wanted to know. And matter of fact, had nephrologist who called me and said, well, what was your creatinine today? He would call me before he even saw it.
Sure.
So that was back in the day before the computers were, where you could get on and look yourself. But in general, FSGS is very fearful the more you learn about it. It's scary, it's anxiety producing, and it causes your body to do a lot of things that you have no control over. Yeah. And that's the scary part.
Can I say one more thing, LeRon?
Of course.
I was also angry that more had not been done to deal with this disease, especially as an African American, looking at the data and seeing the percentage of African American people and other people of color that were affected by this. And I was just angry that there were not any better diagnostic tools. There was no treatment all I got was really blood pressure medication. And then just kind of waiting for me to go on dialysis. And that made me very, very angry.
Did all of you feel angry or have that sort of emotion?
I would say
I never, I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. You know, I felt a little, to me as a mother, I think I felt, the first thing I thought is, what did I do wrong? You know, what did I do wrong? Did I give her the wrong formula as a child? Did I feed her wrong? Like, did I do something to her? Like, so a lot of self-guilt as a mother, that weighed very heavily on me. That was a hard thing for me to handle, is because it's something I couldn't control. And I'm one of those very strong personality type and driven and passionate about everything. And when I turned around and said, my goodness, you know, could have I prevented this? I racked my mind night after night, up all night, thinking about what I had done to her. And then looking back at pictures and seeing if I could notice any signs, like, because it was so out of nowhere, we were so blindsided. Like one day we were skiing, actually, when the first real sign came. We were skiing and it was New Year's Eve weekend, and all of a sudden we were kind of hanging out with some other friends in a lobby of a hotel and playing games, and all of a sudden her hands started locking, her fingers, and she's like, ow, ow, and she's going, ow, you know. And I was like, what's the matter? And she goes, I can't open my fingers, they're locked. And the first thing we thought is, geez, maybe skiing, she was gripping the poles too tight or something. And, you know, what would cause this spasm, this locking in her hands? And she starts screaming, like really painful. And that was a real sign, like, wow, okay, something's messed up. And then, you know, of course, the normal eye swelling and things. So I would go back and I look at pictures. Even now, I look at pictures. I think about things like, what did I do different? She's a twin brother. What did I do different to her that didn't affect him? So that's a hard thing so I think that was one of the hardest things for me to really process, is what I did wrong to cause my daughter to have this. I still probably have guilt over it.
Of course, you know, there was probably nothing, obviously, that you did wrong.
No.
Mm-hmm. I don't think that I was angry, because I didn't know enough about it. There wasn't enough out there to know about it.
Sure.
I mean, early on in the diagnosis in the field, I go in for my exams every 3 months to 6 months with my nephrologist. And I said, anything new in the field? And no, not really. No, I was able to later on in my career go in to be a peer reviewer with the Department of Defense, and got to be on the panels for FSGS.
Oh.
And during that period of time, it finally dawned on me, and I'd been transplanted, I think probably, I can't go back on the timeline, but I'd been transplanted for probably 15 to 20 years at that point in time, maybe a little bit longer. And all that time I looked back and I looked at the history of it. Okay. I looked at the things that were available. And until the word podocyte came up, did I really get interested in what was going on? But that's been a long time. There's been no real heavy duty research in this. It sure hasn't been in my 35 to 40 years of having this condition. And it hasn't been opened up until right now, actually, in the last year to two. And then as an example is what, you know, Goldfinch is doing with the podocyte look. I mean, that's what I call it. There was nothing out there. There's nothing to read. Do a search for it in the literature. Very few
It's
pieces
very
of
hard.
literature on FSGS.
I don't understand why there hasn't been anything done. Like, why is kidney disease so not paid attention to, hasn't been paid attention to by the medical and scientific community? I don't understand it.
You know,
I think it has a lot to do with funding. A lot of it has to do with funding.
Funding.
Yep.
And, you know, I've used this analogy a few times, but one thing that really is interesting to me is when I talk to people and I say, you know, I don't think there's anybody out there who's never heard of cystic fibrosis, multiple sclerosis, things like
Breast
that.
cancer.
And I turn around and I said, you know, 20 years ago, I feel like where we are now with FSGS is something that maybe 20 years ago, cystic fibrosis, I don't know. I mean, I've heard of cystic fibrosis before, but it's a household name. You may not know medically what entails cystic fibrosis or multiple sclerosis or these other household common names, but I feel we are so far behind all of that, and we don't have that big, huge person of platform, a big platform to really get it out there. The person who has that platform to, I know there's been others who have had, Gary Coleman and, other maybe celebrities who have had this disease, but there's no one who's really gone to bat to say, to really stand up as where other multiple sclerosis, cystic fibrosis, and other diseases. So I think that is needed personally. I think you need somebody out there that really has that major platform to get more focus on, and certainly more funding. Funding is really major, and advocate.
Yeah, I think I would certainly agree. I think, part of it is sort of funding. Part of it is that it tends to be rare.
Exactly.
Also, part of it tends to be the population that's affected. And I think Dean sort of highlighted that too. And I think with this panel and Goldfinch, other companies, the academic world is actually, I think, moving in a really rapid and blooming direction for novel therapies. So I think that's great.